Welcome to the Biblical Worldview Show, a ministry of RenewaNation, and I am so excited for part 2 today, where we are discussing the topic of discernment with an author, podcaster, and blogger, Natasha Crain. If you don't know Natasha, and I'd be surprised if you follow this show and don't know her, but if you don't know her, you'll definitely want to go and find her online. Her newest book is called When Culture Hates You. What do we do when culture hates you? And so we're going to talk about when culture hates you and discernment on this episode of the Biblical Worldview Show. You are watching the Biblical Worldview Show. I'm Ben Shetler, and this is a ministry of RenewaNation. Okay, so in the last episode, we talked a little bit about even sometimes songs and ways that bad thinking creeps into churches. And you made a very specific point of, I'm sitting here singing the song going, man, I hope there's not other people, and there probably are, singing the song and having improper expectations about God because the songs are untrue. And we could talk about that again specifically, if you could mention just for people for context what that particular song was. But my question is, how do we handle that? At what point do you go, you know what? I need to speak patiently to the leadership of my church and say, hey, what point are you going like, man, I don't want to be the pest? Because I don't want to be the pest. And then at what point do you go, and it may just be time to move on because I'm not, can two walk together except they be agreed? And I'm very we've been at our current church for like 15 years. I'm not into like hopping around churches, but I know for some people there comes a point where it's like, do I even like, at what point do I have to go, this is just a bridge too far? And I'd be curious if sometimes that you do, at least I do. I don't know if you ever struggle with stuff. You're like, man, I wish they wouldn't sing that or do that. So I don't know. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it is really hard, especially if you do feel kind of like a burden for, always making sure things are theologically sound, and especially with the kinds of work that both you and I do. I think that we're always kind of attuned to seeing those things, and so we probably notice some stuff that we in our heads go, am I making too much of this, or is this significant enough? When do I reach out? I mean, and as a parent too, I mean, you hear about stuff going on, at schools, even though my kids go to a Christian school, where I'm thinking, do I reach out? I'm always that parent, right? Like, mom, the kids are like, are you sending another email? Don't do it. So it's like, we don't want to be that person as a parent. A lot of times we also don't want to be that person in the church. You don't want to be the legalist, the person on the far extreme who's just nitpicking every little thing. And so it is such an important question. It's so funny because I laugh about this every time. There's a song that has the word breakthroughs in it repeatedly. I don't know what it's called, but it's so funny because it has an apostrophe before the S on the slide, on the worship slide. And it drives me crazy because there should not be an apostrophe there. Okay, clearly this is not something I'm going to, be like, hey, can we get rid of the apostrophe? This is driving me crazy. No, but what we had started to talk about in the last episode was that, there's a song that that we had been singing that was something to the effect of, I don't remember the exact lyrics, but I sought the Lord and he answered me, and that's why I trust him. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
And so for context, we were talking about the fact that, it's not why you should trust God just because he answered you. Now, maybe that adds to your personal experience, but we trust God because of who he is.
Yeah.
And so I think, if it's a one-off song, if it's a one-time thing where you see this happening in church, maybe that's not the time where you wave your hand because you don't know. You don't know exactly what's going to go from there. If you see a pattern in church, I think that's when you start to feel like, do I need to say something? Whether it's a pattern in the sermons that you hear, a patterns in the song you sing, a pattern in the youth group materials, and the conversations being had. I will say the exception for me, though, in saying it's a pattern is if there's something that's outright, heresy, like doctrinal error, where your kids are being taught, your kid comes back from youth group and they say, hey, mom, dad, We learned tonight that the resurrection, it could be just like maybe a metaphor for new life. That is, I'm not waiting for a pattern there. The pattern has
Yeah,
been
that's
set
good.
that no, this is actual heresy, that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead, and that makes a huge difference. I'm going straight to the church to find out how this came in, because it might be the case if it's a brand new youth pastor. I mean, you don't know how all this comes in. So at the same time as when you say something right away, we have to not freak out and kind of calmly go to the leadership to ask, here's what I observed. Obviously, this is concerning to me. Is it concerning to you? The pastor might go, oh, wow, I had no idea that this kind of thing was being taught. Or the pastor might say, well, I think that there's a good case to be made for that. When that's the answer, when the pastor is showing concerning theology, like actual heresy, then that's a time that you leave the church.
Mm.
So, and I've also been, not to give too long of an answer to this one question, but it's something I've had to grapple with quite a bit. I've also been in a church that we did end up deciding to leave because they did a book study on Be the Bridge right after 2020. And that's a book that's very much steeped in critical race theory. And when we raised the concern about this book, it was kind of waved off. No one seemed to care about it. No one seemed to think that it was a big deal. And we did end up leaving because we thought that that was representative of some greater discernment issues. So there's
Mm.
no black and white answer to it, but I would say if it's something like, a one-time song that's being sung, okay, you don't need to raise your hand every time you see something like that. Or maybe the pastor said something in a little different way than you would. You don't need to fire off the email. Look for patterns in those things, with the exception being if there's some kind of outright heresy that you see, in which case that's something that needs to be addressed immediately.
Yeah. And we have a lot of Christian educators watching as well or listening, and I think that some of those same things applies. When do I speak out to administration and go, hey, I'm a little concerned about this in our curriculum. I'm concerned about this happening even in a Christian school context. It could be a church context. I think both, and I think especially educators, when you're passionate about the way you do education and philosophy and things like that, it's very easy to send 40 emails a day, so you want to be careful with that. But you're absolutely right. At some point, Christians cannot just go along with it. We have to with patience stand up and say, hey, this is wrong, and we've got to speak against it. And so thank you for that context. All right, so I am looking at this, and I'm going, wait a second. Our final questions we went through because you jumped ahead, Natasha.
I'm
which is
so
which
sorry.
we were in the break. We were discussing how just interviewing people. Sometimes you'll send questions ahead and they'll jump ahead. But it was a great example. Actually, if you hadn't got the questions ahead of time, you would have just naturally jumped there, I think. But because of that, I kind of ran out of some questions. But I have like so many things I'd love to talk to you about. Let me ask you. In your newest book, When Culture Hates You, is there a particular chapter that you were writing and you got to it and you're like, this is something that I was just like, oh yes, like if anybody needed this chapter, and maybe it's every chapter in the book too, but is there one particular one that stuck out to you that you're like, oh, I think this would be helpful to the listeners?
Wow, that's a hard question to ask an author,
Yeah.
because we're thinking every chapter is
Yeah.
critically
Right.
important, right? And I do
Right.
feel like every chapter in this book is very important. The first half of the book, there are 5 chapters there that are basically just helping people understand the hate of culture. And I talk about
Mm,
things like, Jesus said it would happen. That's the first chapter. What
mm,
is the common good is the second chapter. When the common good is
mm.
political is the third chapter. Answering objections to public engagement is another one. And then how do you persevere in light of the costs? Those are the chapters in the first half of the book. So all of those are really important foundational chapters. In the
Oh
second
yeah.
half, of the book, it takes and applies all of that to 5 individual issues, like a Christian nationalism. What exactly is that? And abortion,
Mm,
transgender issues, the sexualization of children, and social justice. And so kind of weaving all those together. But I would say, just we I think maybe like the second chapter, what is the common good? It sounds like such a, I don't know, maybe a boring topic in the light of all the hot topics in the book. Otherwise, like people say, oh, okay, good, the transgender issue or the abortion issue.
yeah.
But if you don't understand how to define what's good for society in the first place, you can't think well through those other issues. And
Mm,
so, this is the most foundational chapter, I think, that's important. And it's interesting because the concept of the common good throughout Christian history has been one that there's been much theology and there's been a rich conversation about what the common good is, but it's kind of been co opted by the left in recent years,
yeah,
interestingly.
yeah.
And so, I've had a couple of people comment online when I've
Like the
said something about the
theological
book.
left or the political left, or both?
Both. I mean, there's
Yeah.
there's a Venn diagram that closely overlaps there, right, for progressive Christians. So it's interesting because there, a lot of key times when you hear the word common good, if you see that online, there's a whole organization about I don't remember what it's called, but it's basically like vote common good. It might even be that. It might even be the website. And when you go on it, they have dozens and dozens of signers to this that they're committing to vote for the common good, but there's not a single one who's not a Democrat. I mean, I actually had someone go and do the research on this, and it's interesting because their view of the common good is very different in a lot of cases than what I think the common good would be according to the Bible. For example, they'll be very pro-abortion. I don't because they're thinking of this from the woman's perspective. They believe that
Mm,
it is a harm to the woman without addressing the harm done to the infant. And so it's interesting because the common good has to be well defined, yet the word gets kind of tossed around. And so in
yeah.
that chapter, I really lay the foundations to say, how do you even think through what is good for society? How do we know objectively what is good, not just based on what people say is good, that
Mm,
we have to look to God for that standard. So that's very foundational. And then the other foundational chapters where I kind of get into, well, what about when the common good is political, are really important as well, because the common good is not just political. We advocate for the common good in all kinds of ways. So this is not just a book about politics, but
yeah.
sometimes the common good is of a political nature. And so I just try to pull people back from the phase where they're kind of like, oh my gosh, politics, don't talk about politics, it's too divisive. I kind of try to just bring them back to saying, well, what is politics? Politics is just the way in which we gather together in communities to figure out how we're going to live together. What are the parameters with which we're going to live in
Yes.
society? That's all politics is. Now, people bring all kinds of baggage to the conversation when they say politics, and that's a whole other conversation. But let's step back from all of that. And let's just say, okay, if this is about deciding how we're going to live together and we want to thrive, we want to flourish, and we want to do that according to God's standards, then how should we define that as Christians? And so I just look at a lot of biblical principles for that. So that's kind of the long answer to your question. But I think there's a lot of important stuff in the book.
Yeah.
But you have to have the foundations right before you can get to the individual topics. And so often, both Christians and non believers address those hot topics without talking about all the presuppositions, the views that have to inform where you get to on those.
Oh, so good. We have an episode on the Biblical Worldview show that I think in the title it's called Christian Nationalism and the Gospel or something, something like that. But I think it's a 2 or 3 part episode, and I spend 15 minutes just defining politics. And I want to kind of jump off there because for several reasons. One, what you said about knowing the context of things helps you to understand why other things are important. And that has kind of been a theme in this interview. And it has been really powerful for me because I do sometimes get frustrated with, well, why don't people see this as important? And the reason is because they don't understand the background. And I think you highlighting that has been so helpful to me. And I think for all of us, there's a reason why I spent 15 minutes defining politics. And it's because we have so many different definitions of what it is that once you clarify what it is, most people are going like, oh yeah, Christians should be involved in politics if that's what you mean by it. It's almost like it almost answers all the questions. And one of the things, and I'd be curious to get your response to this. So I've seen a lot of people get this wrong in one way, and then the resolution gets it wrong even more, creating an even bigger problem. So let's take something like abortion. For whatever reason, there are a lot of evangelical pastors that won't talk about politics at all, but they'll make an exception for abortion. So they're like, I don't talk about politics, but then they'll talk about how abortion is wrong, which is obviously a political issue. So then what they say is, well, this isn't a political issue. This is a biblical issue. Like that's the phrase they use. But then to me, you've just gotten one thing wrong and then you got it even more wrong because what you're saying then is the Bible is totally isolated from our conversations about the way we structure our society, that we shouldn't include the Bible in it. And then on the other hand, you've gone, well, wait a second, but really it isn't isolated, but we're going to use bad terminology to allow the Bible back in to our bad theology. And the reality is you have good theology when you want to apply the Bible to the issue of abortion, but you have bad terminology when you call it not political. It is political, and I think people just need to become comfortable with the reality that the Bible speaks to the way that we structure our society, which is politics. I hope I didn't. This is your interview, but I don't know.
No, that is
It's on my
so
mind.
perfectly said. I mean, I'm like sitting here nodding vigorously, saying, yes, yes, yes. That is so well said. And I see that as well, that sometimes the pastors, just exactly what you're saying, that, they'll say, oh, yeah, I definitely want to speak to, some of the key, or they'll say moral issues. So they might say political, or they might say moral, and they'll say, I speak to something like abortion, but, I don't get political. And so I absolutely have seen this. And the problem with doing that is that, as you're saying, the bad terminology here is that it kind of cements in people's minds that there's a difference between morality and the political, as if we're not supposed to be political. So their pastor is saying, well, I'm talking to this because it's a moral issue, but I'm not getting political. It still leaves people thinking, okay, I'm not supposed to be political. So it tells them the wrong message that they're taking away from that. And as you just said so well, I mean, moral issues and political issues go hand in hand. I mean, anytime you are trying to come up with the rules around which you're going to structure society, the political, anytime you're doing that, you're going to have moral questions, because at the heart of any society are questions about who is a person, how should we live, how should we treat one another. Those are worldview questions. Every single one of them. Yes. And what we see today is that the progressive left very often has a totally different view of anthropology, the nature of mankind. And so if you get anthropology wrong, like who is a person, what are we here for, what's the purpose, you're going to get all your policies wrong. You're going to think that, well, of course we should allow for transgender surgeries for minors. Of course we should do that, because that's allowing people to have, be their authentic self. But that's a matter of anthropology. That is saying that you're your own boss, that there's nothing greater than you. And so you should be able to live out whatever you think you are. But that is not a biblical anthropology. A biblical anthropology would say that man is created by God, that we are designed personally and socially in certain ways to live, that there's a plan for a family, there's a plan for marriage, there's a plan for sexuality. All of those things have a design. So when you understand the biblical anthropology, that's going to lead you to vastly different conclusions than the anthropology that underlies much of the progressive policies that we see today. So you can't separate out these issues. And if any pastor is listening who happens to use that, terminology, I would just encourage you to not use that terminology, to say, yes, I'm going to speak about things that are political in nature, that have some kind of bearing on how we manage ourselves as a society, as I should, given Romans 13, which tells us that government is put there, and the civil rulers are there because they're given authority by God to promote good and to restrain evil. That is the function of government. And so if that's the case, then we shouldn't be afraid to be political. We should absolutely be advocating for righteousness in society, advocating for what is good and restraining what is evil. It's literally said in the Bible, the purpose for government. I mean, literally, you can go to Romans 13 and you can see this. That's what the purpose is there for. So why should we ever be afraid to say we're talking about something political today? We're just talking about the nature of our society. It should never be a fear. I think that we just don't talk enough about political theology in the church for people to go, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, of course. But there's not enough guidance that's being given. So sorry. So that's a soapbox one for me, because you're so right. I encounter that so much. I can't stand that false delineation between the political and the moral, or the political and the biblical. It all runs together because Christianity is true, and therefore it is true for all of life.
Yeah. And I say it another way, too, is I think let's take a break. We'll be right back. When it comes to Gen Z, you're actually talking about a generation that could impact the world in terms of technology, possibilities, in a way that no generation ever has. But also when you're talking about Gen Z, this is a generation that doesn't know how to find the truth. They don't know how to disagree. They don't understand human identity. They don't know how to fail. And they don't know how to use the Bible as an external creed. And so when people look at these problems, I feel like they kind of diagnose it one of two ways. On one hand, they recognize that we are in a truly apocalyptic scenario with Generation Z and the lies that are being pushed on them to a point where this will upend all of culture. Then on the other hand are people that tend to be a little bit of deniers. They say, well, yeah, Gen Z faces these issues, but it's not really as bad. Times have always been bad. It is very true that there is significant dangers facing Gen Z. But it is not true that there is nothing that we can do about it. And so at the Center for Truth and Love, we created this resource that we believe will help you understand the lies and the challenges that Gen Z is facing while equipping you to faithfully know what the Bible says and how you can lead them through those challenges. We're talking with Natasha Crain on the Biblical Worldview Show, a ministry of RenewaNation. Thanks for joining us. If you haven't yet subscribed, definitely do, though, and check out Natasha's newest book, which you can pre-order now, When Culture Hates You. And would that ever happen? Well, of course it happens now. Culture does hate us. And so how do we navigate that biblically? You'll definitely want to pre-order her book. So, Natasha, we were talking right before the break about this issue of separating politics from Scripture, and I wanted to add to that. I do think that what we're saying without realizing it is that God's word is not good enough for our society. It may be good enough for the way we parent. It may be good enough to govern our marriages. And it may even be good enough to tell us how we should run our churches. But for our society, the Bible really is not good enough or relevant. And when you make the Bible irrelevant to these issues, then that's when the next generation goes, well, why am I reading this at all? And I think there were a lot of churches that had made the Bible irrelevant to most of life, and then COVID hit, and there were people that didn't come back. Why? Because they had never made the Bible relevant. They were coming out of cultural norms. It was like, well, we just go on Sundays. And then they're like, well, wait a second, we don't really need this because we haven't made it relevant. But the churches that were willing to apply the Bible to what was happening in culture all grew during COVID. They all they're all like exploding. And I think it's because the Bible was meant to be applied to all of life. And that's really what your ministry is all about, is thinking through biblical worldview. But one of the things that you kind of started early on, and like you said, you're speaking to others, is parents, is you talk a lot to parents. And I am a dad. I have one cute, but he actually, when he was born, I believe he broke the Guinness record for cuteness, and that is measured subjectively by his two parents, and I think his grandparents are in on that too. Of course they have other grandkids, so maybe not, but so I have a 3-year-old and you have teenagers, correct?
3 teenagers.
So here's my question. I think this would be relevant to younger parents, and then also any teachers in the element. What were a few things that you did as a parent that your kids are teenagers now? So I'm going to ask this question in 2 parts. So part 1 is, what are some things you're doing now that you hope other parents would do? So that the answer to that is coming. But before we get to that question, and that'll be our last question, and then this question is, I'm a parent of a 3-year-old. If you could go back in time, what is something that you are glad that you did, or maybe you would change, or you'd say, hey, I'm really glad I did this with my kids. And Ben, I recommend that you and your wife do this and other parents do this as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the most important thing looking back that we did would be that we were just continually talking about our faith in the home.
Mm.
It was never something that was only, once a week on Sunday mornings. It was never, I mean, church has always been important. We always went to church every week for sure, but it wasn't just then. We didn't have a Sunday faith in our house. And I think that we made that very clear to our kids from an early age, because we were continually talking about things, continually bringing things back in our home to, oh, well, here's an example of this, or, just being very proactive in how we had those conversations. I mean, that's really the heart of my first 3 books that we talked about in our last episode of, between those 3 books, there are 100 different conversations to have with your kids. And I can't say that I've had every single one, even with my own kids, but we've had many of those conversations over time. And I give examples in those books of how we led into that. So having those conversations just continually on an ongoing basis, that was really important, because it's just made for an environment in which everyone knows, well, we can just talk about this stuff. And so I think that that's been especially important.
So I'm going to summarize by saying having good conversations, but also having an environment that, hey, we can discuss this. I had that in my home, and the school I went to, church I went to, was very conservative, very strict. But in the home, any conversation could be had. Like I may have a teacher be like, "How dare you ever ask that?" But I'm like, well, my parents don't buy, like my parents. And I think that was really good. And I think teachers need to be open now to those conversations. And I think you do have to understand the difference between someone trying to assault authority via a pseudo question and then someone really genuinely seeking. And but if someone's really seeking, don't denigrate them for the question. Welcome the question and try to answer it. That's really good. What is something moving forward? So do you mind sharing the age of your kids? I had 14 and 12, but I think those are old numbers.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I need to update my website. No, I have twins who are 15, and I have a 14-year-old. So it almost feels like triplets, but yes, I have 3 teenagers now. And I just want to add really quickly something else I think is so important that we've always done. And we've done lots of things wrong. So this is not like, oh, I have more to tell you about that we did well. We could have a whole conversation about things we didn't do well, but also just constantly talking about what other people believe. So not just talking about the truth, but comparing the truth to the falsehoods and telling people, well, a lot of people believe this. And I think when you do that framing it that way helps kids start thinking more about what they believe. Because if the only thing that they ever hear is truth, they don't know how to evaluate in the context of everything else. And I think that has been especially powerful now, seeing my kids become teenagers, that background knowledge I can see come out a lot. It's been very, very helpful that we always talked about, well, this is what other people believe. This is what the world is saying.
Oh, that's really good. All right. Well, I'd love to have more and more conversations with Natasha Crain. When her book comes out, there's a possibility we may have her back on the show, which would be really exciting. But Natasha, thank you so much for joining us. You can check out those other books which she mentioned in the preceding episode. We'll put those in the notes. But her most current book is I've once again should have written this down. When Culture Hates You. When Culture Hates You. Definitely go and check that out. Any Unshaken Faith events coming up?
Well, I don't know when this episode's going to air, but we have unshakenconference.com has all the upcoming dates. And so we have 2 more dates coming up this fall, in fall 24, and we're continually working to get more. So we'll be looking at some 2025 dates soon.
I try to do my best to connect people to what you're doing, but is there anything else that you'd recommend where people go, maybe join the Faithfully Different Facebook page? Any other recommendations of other resources that people can get from you that could be a help to them?
Well, everything's kind of at my hub on my website. So you can go to natashacrain.com, and Crain is CRAIN, and you can see the blog posts that I do there. And also my podcast is called the Natasha Crain Podcast. And then I have a joint one that I co-host with Elisa Childers called Unshaken Faith.
Thank you so much again for being with us. You're watching and have been watching or listening to the Biblical Worldview Show, a ministry of RenewaNation. If you have yet to subscribe, definitely subscribe to our show and maybe even share it with a friend if you found this helpful. I want to thank the guest today, our guest, Natasha Crain, for taking time out of her busy schedule to really help us think through the topic of discernment and even raising children. And we'll see you next time on the Biblical Worldview Show.